So thanks everyone for joining us today in the latest in Meridian West series of 30-minute webinars. Today we're going to be digesting all things thought leadership, particularly with a focus on how you find the right topics, the right sweet spot for your firm's thought leadership. A lot of conversations that we have revolve around how do we find the best topics, how do we find niches or areas that perhaps competitors haven't been talking about, and importantly, how do we make sure that those topics are going to be of relevance to buyers of professional services and help to support the firm's brand and ultimately its sales and marketing activity. So to try and unpick all of that in the next 30 minutes, I'm delighted to be joined by a number of my colleagues, Meridian West founder director Ben Kent, and also senior consultants Peter Vaughan-Fowler and Ellie Berry. So let's dive into thought leadership. And I thought it might be quite interesting to have a look where we are at this, not quite halfway through 2024, but certainly a good way through the year so far. I wonder, just from what you're seeing at the moment, team, in terms of, are you seeing particular topics really jumping out in terms of thought leadership? One would naturally expect perhaps things like AI to be dominating the agenda around thought leadership, but is that the case? What are you seeing? Peter, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, yes, I would say we are certainly seeing a lot on AI and sort of more broadly digital transformation. I think as well as that, what we've seen a lot of is kind of continued outputs on the topics of ESG sustainability, but seems to be a bit of an increase on governance as well, and sort of the social impact piece. And then I think another sort of trend or theme that we've seen quite a lot, and this is connected, I think, in part to that AI piece, is about the sort of the war for talent and talent more broadly. Great.
Ben, how does that reflect what you're seeing?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much sort of spot on. But I think what people are doing now is kind of that first phase of just talking about AI or ESG in sort of broad terms, and the importance of those issues. I think what we're now doing is getting kind of actually more useful thought leadership, which is of diving into who's actually the user cases of AI, focusing on particular areas or particular sectors. So it's kind of thought leadership getting practical, if you like.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And Ellie, what's grabbed your attention so far this year by way of thought leadership? Any particular topics or particular pieces stand out for you?
Yeah, I would just sort of add to the AI piece. I think one thing that we're starting to see a lot more is sort of, the ethical implications of AI. The conversation going from like, should we do this? How do we use AI to do this? To how do we use AI ethically to do this? And I think that's quite a big sort of reflection on how thought leadership practices has sort of developed over time. Of, at the beginning, I think thought leadership was more of a sort of emotional primer sort of to potential clients and sort of current clients, whereas now it's more, expectations have widened around it, and it's really about, encompassing that sort of trust and purpose and, responsibility of an organization. So I think a lot of these trends we're seeing are really reflective of that and sort of how they want to influence, the wider company and their own employees, not just sort of potential clients and current clients.
Interesting. And just a quick reminder, those joining us today, if you've got a question or an observation, do put them into the chat or the Q&A, and we'll try and pick those up as we go through. We'd love to hear what you're seeing by way of thought leadership topics, anything in particular that's really jumped out at you so far this year. Just to stay on this track a little bit longer, Ben, what do you think this focus on AI and thought leadership is telling us about where professional firms are really kind of focusing strategically at the moment? Are they, is your sense that people are just focusing on this topic because they feel they have to, or does it tell us something more important about the state of play more generally?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a danger, that these topics are kind of fashionable and people feel like they've got to say something about AI, and I think clients can kind of smell that, if you like. So I think it's kind of really leaning into what's your kind of area of expertise around this. So for law firms, it's very much about the risks associated with it, any contracts you might have. I think that's how you can show kind of authenticity. I think there's a sort of a yearning for authenticity and real expertise.
And can you say just a little bit more about that authenticity? It's an interesting word. What do you mean by that?
Well, because we do quite a lot of research amongst consumers of thought leadership, and the issue is that, partly driven by AI, was just so much more of it, and it's not just by professional services firms; it's also the business journals and so on. So people are absolutely inundated, and I think what people really kind of yearn for is people. Let's take AI as an example. People have actually implemented it, and what have they used it for? And no kind of no hyped view of the kind of practical implications of implementing it and the organizational challenges around that. I think what people is a big turn off is just talking about it in broad terms. What I think by expertise they don't necessarily mean is needing an AI expert talking in detail. That's not what it wants. It's the kind of user cases.
Interesting. And Peter, just to kind of reflect on a little bit about, I guess what you're seeing, you obviously brought in this topic of AI, but any other kind of key topics you talked about? ESG, what are we seeing in that space at the moment?
Yeah, so I think, as I mentioned, I think what we're seeing a bit more of is, firms talking about governance and the sort of social impact piece. So we worked on a piece of thought leadership looking at logistics and real estate last year with a law firm, and one of the kind of real sort of pieces of interest for the firm was around, okay, what's the social impact of warehouses effectively? And I think it sort of reflects the growing sense of responsibility I think that professional firms feel they have for a wider group of stakeholders than was the case maybe traditionally. So I think that's definitely something that I've noticed in the first part of this year.
It's definitely something that I would echo. I think we've seen that from a number of particularly in the real estate space, where I've done a lot of work supporting on thought leadership projects. We've seen that focus around what's the social impact of the built environment, for example, broadening that ESG topic around not just the focus on the environment. Clearly that's really important. Big focus still on net zero. Many of the kind of decarbonisation goals that organisations and countries are set are edging ever closer. So I think I suspect there will be that sustained focus on that as more action is needed. But broadening out, as you said, that ESG, looking particularly at the social impact, but also some of those broader governance topics as well. It was interesting, just in preparation for today, one of the things I did is I had a look at some of the larger B2B and advisory firms, what kinds of topics and insights are they putting out there on the front page of their website, or the kind of insights page on their website. And the topics that we've talked about, I think unsurprisingly have featured quite a lot. But it was interesting to me, for example, Deloitte have a ranking at the moment, their top 10 most read pieces of content. Number one was around AI, but it was really around their pieces called the AI regulations that aren't being talked about. And I think that tells us something perhaps around, to your point, I think, Ben, you talked about kind of use cases, but also maybe looking at things through the lens of risk, regulation, perhaps these slightly more prosaic elements than just the kind of big picture blue sky thinking around AI. What's your impression on that one, Ben?
Yeah, it's interesting. So we do research on what's the hot topics, on the challenges facing clients, and by far actually regulatory complexity is number one. And and there's a bit of a mismatch. There's not that much on regulation and thought leadership, and certainly I've done historically done lots on new regulations that people are very interested in, on the impact, how to deal with regulators who are increasingly proactive, increasingly joining up across jurisdictions. How do you, actually implement these things without destroying your business model? So I think that's a very fertile area around managing regulatory complexity.
And Ellie, just to bring you back in, I mean, I'm interested, your thoughts around perhaps are the topics that we'd expect to see more of that we're not seeing much of at the moment, or what's your feel around what we might see as we move into the second part of this year and beyond?
Yeah, so I think one area which we sort of touched on is sort of the future of work, I think there'll be a lot more out of that in terms of sort of reskilling and upskilling. I think we already are starting to hear a lot more sort of clients coming to us for support around sort of L&D, and I think obviously that feeds into the sort of pace of AI and tech continuing to accelerate, and maybe sort of potentially exploring some of those sort of innovative sort of training program thought leadership ideas. So yeah, the sort of future of learning in the digital age, if you like.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to me that I think we're in a position now where the workforce is multi-generational, 3 perhaps 4 generations all working together in quite different ways. And certainly the piece around AI then touches on skills, it touches on how organizations operate. I think it's got a big implication. We've seen a few interesting pieces over the last couple of years kind of focused on Gen Z, but I think actually rather than shining a spotlight just on that generation, I think this topic of multi-generational workforce I think is has a lot of untapped potential, would be my sense.
I think that's right, and I think the other thing we're seeing, we're doing a piece for a firm that specializes in reward, and it's kind of, employees want much more choice about where they work, how often they work, and also what their reward package is. And a real challenge about communication, so much communication is digital, which is fine if you're in the kind of white collar, but it's a real challenge if you've got lots of frontline stuff. So you can do some really interesting segmentation work around that.
So it sounds like firms out there are not short of potential topics. There's lots of meat to chew on, but with that also comes the question, well, where do you start? What does a good topic look like? So maybe let's focus on that question now. I mean, Peter, what's your sense, when you're working with clients, trying to evaluate what a good potential topic for thought leadership might look like? Are there any particular criteria or factors you use to help determine that?
So I think one really valuable resource for determining a good topic is listening to your clients and seeing what is it that your clients are interested in. I think if you can talk about your clients' opportunities and challenges and offer guidance and a distinct point of view on that, then that's going to be a really strong topic. So I think something that we often work with law firms who have quite mature client listening programs, and actually just digging into that data to really find what your clients are talking about, what's top of mind for them. I think that's a really good starting place. I think the other thing I'd say is just sort of ensuring that whatever you're going to be talking about, you can collect some really robust data and do some robust research so that whatever you're saying is sort of evidence-based. And I think if you compare those two things, you can arrive at a really good topic.
Ben, other criteria you might use to come up with what or evaluate what's a good topic?
Yeah, so we kind of have this framework, which is, a good topic kind of ticks 3 boxes. Clearly it's of interest to the client, but it's also somewhere where you've got a point of view, and last but not least, it's somewhere where provides an opportunity to sell services. So I think that's quite a useful criteria. So we run these ideas labs where we sort of brainstorm ideas, but then we score each idea on those 3 elements.
So it's interesting. So it's almost finding a kind of that sweet spot between the 3. It's not just what's an interesting topic, but it's got to have commercial value for the firm as well.
Correct.
And Ellie, what's your sense? Kind of effective topics. Anything you'd add?
Yeah, I think just adding sort of on what I think is very important to sort of think about before you jump into it is also just the content aspect. I think often you can think about a lot at the beginning, which the objectives and the audience, which are all really important, but you also need to think about, okay, how are we actually going to sort of activate this campaign? And I think that can often be sort of a big pitfall, as you get all these insights and then they don't truly sort of bring anything new. And I think thinking about what do you want your audience to think about your brand or your organization from the content that you're going to sort of release, and how do you want them to sort of action that or be influenced by it, which I think is an important thing to think about.
It's interesting. And is your sense that firms have quite clear goals around that, or is that something which tends to require quite a bit of thinking?
I mean, I think, just thinking about experience and working with clients, I think often clients sort of have an idea of potential topics. I think sometimes come to the table with, like 3 or 4, like we think this will, our clients would really like to hear about this. But I think not really sure about how and what they're going to do with that, and like what they want to how they want to measure the success of their campaign from that. Which is, again, I think a big part of the beginning bit of sitting down in a room in a workshop and actually starting to think about how you're going to measure and what activation looks like for you.
I can see you nodding earnestly there, Peter. Would you agree with what Ellie's been saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just thinking of one particular client in the past where they had a really clear goal of and it sort of came out actually in the Ideas Lab workshop we had with them, that actually what was really important to them was booking, a number of meetings with some target prospects in the EMEA region. And so that became that was the sort of measure of success, and they're going to use this piece of thought leadership as a catalyst for sort of having those conversations. And then they could sort of work back from that to think, okay, well, what does it need to look like to engage that audience? So yeah, totally agree with what Ellie was saying. I think thinking of how you're going to measure the success of the thought leadership from the very beginning really is critical to the success of it.
Mm-hmm. And is there a risk perhaps that we try to get thought leadership to do, too much, in the sense that, some clients say, look, it's about building our brand, we want to connect with prospects, we want to have lots of content, we want to be doing conferences, events, we want to be doing everything. Ben, what's your sense? Do you have to make choices between what those primary goals are, or can thought leadership touch a lot of those boxes?
I think it can do both. It takes a lot of skill. I'm going to be honest, we're working with one big global firm at the moment, and they said, oh, well, we've got all these different service lines that all want a bit of this thought leadership. So we had 1 or 2 questions on a broad range of topics. And I wasn't convinced by that approach, to be honest. I think what you're better off is picking a topic which might provide opportunities for a broad range of services. The logistics one was good. It worked for real estate, it worked for digital. And then thinking quite thoughtfully about the kind of the sales funnel, if you like, so creating content that will be lead generating on your website, but then how do you kind of then take them to the next level? And I think if you can have a goal about generating sales meetings, that's when you can really show return on investment, and there are techniques for doing that.
Interesting. And Ben mentioned, I think, before, this idea of the kind of Ideas Lab framework. I'm interested, perhaps, Peter, in your experiences running those kind of sessions, engaging stakeholders at the start. What any ideas on kind of what works well there, or particular pitfalls to avoid from your experience?
Yeah, so I think with the Ideas Lab, one of the reasons they're really successful is it's about getting all of the internal stakeholders in a room together to discuss the topics. And, actually that way you can sort of really identify amongst the group that there's a huge amount of expertise and a lot of people who can talk to these topics with really interesting things to say. So I think the key kind of thing is about building that internal engagement from the very beginning of the project. Yeah.
Great. Ellie, any thoughts on kind of pitfalls to avoid?
Yeah, I think the buy-in and the engagement piece is very important, not just with that group of stakeholders, but for the wider business in general. I think, as Peter said, what's quite powerful about those workshops is getting stakeholders in a room and starting to realise, how much expertise is there. And I think that's always quite refreshing when you see themselves realise that they have something to say and they have something different to say. And I think by really sort of encouraging that thinking across the business, even sort of at a junior level, starting to give people sort of the autonomy to start to think and write and challenge sort of viewpoints, I think that can be really successful for sort of implementing long-lasting, good sort of thought leadership skills and thinking.
I just quickly as well, I think just as Ellie was talking, she reminded me of something. I think one of the pitfalls to sort of try and avoid there is sort of managing it carefully by, at the same time getting everybody in a room, but also setting clear parameters around what the research can consist of, because I think if you don't have those parameters, then it can quickly turn into what Ben described earlier, where every person in the room wants a question of their own in the survey, and suddenly it's 30 questions long and it's way too broad. So I think it's sort of finding that balance between getting everybody's insight and buy-in, but also not letting everybody have a say on the research.
Yeah,
and
it'll become very bland.
Yeah, almost lowest common denominator, right? That's almost the exact opposite of what you want to do. And I think, from my experience, one of the things that I definitely try and encourage clients to do is to kind of almost take a hypothesis driven approach. So you really want to say, look, what do we know now? So Ellie, to your point, getting everybody in a room, getting that knowledge out on the table, getting those stories, the client stories, those kind of people who've got the ear to the market, what are they hearing? But also thinking about, let's take AI, the topic of the moment. Let's think through, what is the future of that? What are we going to look like in 5 years? What does that mean for clients in terms of the challenges or opportunities they might face? And then also thinking about that appetite for not being controversial, but I think for being provocative, having a point of view, coming up with hypotheses that might feel a little bit outside of the comfort zone. But, if you're then going to go down the route of, surveying, original research, you can get some data to really kind of substantiate and either back that up and validate it, or at least give you a sense of, the scenarios and hypotheses that are more likely for clients. So, I think that process of ideas workshopping is really crucial. And I think just one of the big pitfalls I see is that people kind of just really dive in. They go straight to I've got 10 great questions without really thinking through how we're going to use this, what's this going to tell us, and is this going to be something which is, as to your point, Ben, going to engage people at the top of the sales funnel right through to that kind of sales opportunity. Ben, any kind of last thoughts before we move on, just in terms of that initial kind of workshopping? Any pitfalls or things to kind of make sure people think about when it comes to identifying topics?
Yeah, I think always before you do the ideas lab, we always do a sort of white space mapping to see what's been published out there. Doesn't take too long, but I think it helps you find that unique voice. I think the second thing I would do is, let's say you're doing a project for the real estate practice, is always include partners from other practice areas as well, because I think thought leadership, then you can really identify the cross-selling opportunities and get slightly different voices. So you're doing it from a kind of business issue perspective on the service line perspective.
Yeah. And I think ultimately as well, identifying those key individuals, and I think it's that kind of carrot and stick, isn't it? We want to kind of give you that platform to demonstrate your expertise, put you in front of people, ideally get you onto the media, get you in conferences, but also setting some expectations about what that means in terms of providing that context, that point of view.
Exactly.
And I think I would just add that, and also having a sort of documented campaign strategy that's agreed upon as well from the start. I feel like the strategic planning part, as we've said, is often overlooked, but really having that sort of agreed at the beginning and like sort of documented is always really useful.
Great. For the last 5 minutes or so, let's maybe think about a couple of different scenarios. So, there may be a number of people on the session now or kind of watching back who maybe their firm hasn't really done much thought leadership. Maybe there's some skepticism about doing it. They perhaps don't have a track record, but really interested. Peter, any kind of thoughts around, firms or marketeers who are kind of keen to look at thought leadership for the first time? Where should they start? Any tips or advice?
Yeah, I think as I said a while ago, just start with your clients and what is going to be top of mind for them, their challenges and opportunities. And I think, as Ben said, that sort of those three considerations: clients, new sales as well, and the last one being the kind of point of view, so that you're actually sort of getting something with a clear point of view across. I think just something else to consider is not to underestimate the internal expertise you might have. and just talking internally and sort of building up engagement internally. And I think quickly you'll then find actually there's probably quite a big appetite to do some thought leadership, but also a huge amount of expertise that you can lean on. And then I think as well, the other thing I'd think for someone who hasn't necessarily done much thought leadership before, or a firm that hasn't done much, is you can be quite sort of ambitious and future looking with your thought leadership, which I think is really exciting. And so I would sort of encourage them to be ambitious and future looking when they're thinking about these topics.
Yeah, I agree with that one. We're doing a project at the moment, first time they've done thought leadership. What we're trying to show is the link between business performance and your reward strategy and how you pay people. And so I thought, gosh, that's an ambitious goal, but it's we've gotten great results.
Yeah. Well, if you can find the secret sauce there, I'm sure that will generate lots of interest.
I'll tell you the answer later.
that's part two, is it? So I guess let's think about then. Some firms maybe have put their toe in the water, done something quite high impact last year, 18 months ago, maybe now thinking do we kind of repeat that, what do we do? Is there a kind of wave two? Is there a second iteration? Ben, any kind of thoughts around how you can build a year-on-year campaign, or kind of think about kind of repeating what you've done in the past?
Yeah, I think kind of pulse repeat barometers work really well. Clients really like them. It really builds presence for your brand over the longer term. My recommendation is to keep some tracking questions, maybe about business sentiment or key challenges, but then each wave focusing on a specific area. And also a kind of great way of kind of keeping these things fresh is, well, as a couple of techniques we've used, is first of all using kind of benchmarking. So you benchmark one firm against the other, and that people love that benchmark our implementation of AI versus other businesses in our peer group. And we've got this tool which enables people to do those personal benchmarks. Super valuable, fantastic sales development tool. And the second technique is kind of creating segmentations. So you can, based on the questions you ask, you can put people into different segments. It's a really engaging way. People love to say, well, I answer these questions and I'm in that segment. And what are the strategies if I'm sitting in that segment? So it's a great way of engaging your audience.
And it's really interesting. I think, if you think about some of possibly some of the best known thought leadership, actually it is those that research that has been multi-year on year. I think PwC's CEO survey is now kind of 25 years old plus, and that gets it seems to be every year more and more traction. Ellie, any thoughts again on those that are kind of keen to perhaps turn a great thought leadership piece into a longer series or a more expansive series?
Yeah, I think don't be afraid to go out and really get feedback in other forms, whether that's conversations with your clients, whether that's over sort of social media, sort of LinkedIn, really trying to start that sort of community of asking questions and having them answered. I think also trying different formats of content. I think that can always work. Trying in little, as Ben said, those pulse surveys, little bite-sized bits of information, whether that's podcasts, sort of videos, but thinking about how you can sort of diversify the content that you're releasing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just increasingly now there's so much that you can do in terms of content strategy, so many different channels, so an investment in a piece of thought leadership doesn't just have to mean a one-off drop to the market of content at a single moment in time. Actually, many of the most successful pieces that I've worked on haven't have had a life cycle of 6-12 months plus, because it's really valuable content that you can repurpose in different formats. Fantastic. We're getting towards the end of our conversation. So before I wrap up, just want to remind people that we've got a second webinar coming up on the 7th of May, also on thought leadership, and there we'll be diving into the topic of data, It's come up a little bit today, but I think how you really use data to elevate the impact of thought leadership. So we'll be talking a lot more about research, about content, about output. But I want to thank our experts today, Peter, Ben, and Ellie. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your days.